Hi everybody, my name is Katherine and I'm super excited to be here as part of Science Literacy Week. I'm an engineer and a children's book author, and I'm really honored to be asked to be here as a biomedical engineering mentor. So, a little bit about my background. I grew up in Edmonton, Alberta, where I went to school at the University of Alberta for mechanical engineering. I didn't always know I wanted to be an engineer. I think at some point I wanted to be a veterinarian, sometimes I wanted to be a doctor, and why I ended up deciding on engineering is because I really liked math and science, and I wanted to help people solve problems. I think that's kind of what engineering is about at its core, is solving problems. So I chose to go into mechanical engineering, which is a field that looks at things that move. So machines, mechanisms, fluids, things like cars, things like robots, that kind of thing. And I really wanted to specialize in what's called biomedical engineering. So that's taking engineering principles and applying them to solve medical problems. So some of the cool stuff that I got to do while I was in this program is I worked with bone casts. So if you break a bone, you get a cast, and definitely those can be made more effective. I also worked in a lab that was studying scoliosis braces. So for people who have curvature in their spine, one of the treatments is that you wear a brace around your torso. And so we were looking at how you can make that kind of bracing more effective. So after I finished my undergraduate degree, which took 5 years, so it would have been in about grade 17, I decided that I still wanted to learn more. And so I went into what's called graduate school, still in mechanical engineering. And in graduate school, I worked in a research lab that looked at prosthetic limbs. So for someone who's missing, say, an arm, typically they'll wear what's called a prosthetic or artificial arm to replace that. And so we were looking at how you can make these robotic prosthetic arms work better. So be easier to control, be easier to feel with, and just looking at how you can test how they're working. So that was super cool. And then a couple of years ago, we moved to Ottawa, Ontario, which is where I am now, and I'm working at a company that's developing blood test devices. So we're working on a small portable blood test device that you would put next to a patient, and if the doctor is trying to figure out what the problem was, what's wrong with that patient, they can take a blood sample and test it on our device, and it will help the doctor figure out what's wrong and how to make that patient feel better. So all throughout my career, I've been super interested in science outreach, so doing stuff like this with kids and students to try and explain how cool science and engineering is and how it can apply to so many parts of our life. And so actually this year, I was able to publish a children's book on robotics and programming. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. But that's kind of where a lot of my interests lie. Outside of that, I really like traveling and visiting with family. I like camping and playing soccer. And I also like hanging out with my cat named Tonks. So I think science literacy is incredibly important. I remember when I was a teenager, I asked my grandma, what's the biggest difference between when you were a teenager and now? And what she told me is just, it has to do with the amount of information that's out there. So when she was a teenager, there were 2 newspapers, and everybody kind of read them, everybody had the same background knowledge. But nowadays with the internet, you can find information on anything you want, and some of it's true and some of it's not. And it's really hard to tell when it's not accurate. So science literacy is important because it helps us develop these critical thinking skills so that we can look at new information that's given to us and decide whether or not it's trustworthy. So, where did that information come from? How did they draw their conclusions? And these are all kinds of things that we need to kind of work on and learn to do. And that's really what science literacy lets us do. So I want to talk to you about 2 different books today. The first one I'll talk to you about is called The Boreal Forest by L.E. Carmichael. This is a really, really cool book that totally fits within the theme of biodiversity. And it's really, really interesting because it talks about the boreal forest, which actually runs all through Canada. Many of you might even live in the boreal forest. And it's a really interesting book because it goes into a lot of the science and the background of the biome that is the boreal forest. So it talks about different creatures like flying squirrels and beavers and moles and that kind of stuff, and some of the neat facts about those creatures. And it talks about the ecosystem and how everything is connected. And it goes, all around the world, from Canada to Russia to Finland, and talks about how the different types of boreal forests fit into the big picture. So definitely recommend this as part of your reading list for biodiversity. The second book I wanted to talk about is If Ball Then Catch. This is actually a book that I wrote. So this book doesn't really have much to do with biodiversity, but it instead is about robotics and coding. So it's about a girl named Dot who's given a robotic dog for her birthday, and she has to learn how to train it. And so the book goes through kind of this process of the girl learning how to train a robotic dog, and when you read it, you actually learn about robotics and coding as well. And it's been pretty fun to put together, and you learn all about different types of things like if-else statements, you learn about counting, you learn about memory, and yeah, it's been really fun to work on. So biodiversity is all around us. It's in the air that we're breathing, it's in the water we're drinking, and it's even in the food that we're eating. And so that's kind of what I wanted to talk about today in terms of how important it is, because without biodiversity, I wouldn't have all these tomatoes for my garden. So to grow a tomato, you need to have really good soil, and that soil has to be full of nutrients. The nutrients come from things like compost, which is old scraps of vegetables that have been broken down into small pieces by things like worms and insects. So we need to have good soil. We need to have good sunlight and good rain and a good ecosystem of everything working together. And we need to have pollination of all the flowers, so that can be done by the wind or by the bees. But to grow tomatoes like this, you need to have really good biodiversity. So it's super, super important, and it's definitely something that's worth learning a lot about. So that's it for me. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that you learned something. And if you're interested in learning more about the book that I wrote, please check out www.ifballthencatch.ca. Thanks, bye!